The thrust reverser exists for one job: to slow a plane down on the runway. A single lever, pulled at the wrong moment, threw the engines into reverse. The thrust that was meant to slow the plane on the runway instead pushed it out of the sky. These are the deadliest reverse thrust disasters in aviation history. Subscribe to Terra Obscura before we begin. The airline was named for a man who had once nearly burned to death in a racing car. Niki Lauda was a three-time Formula One world champion. In 1976, his Ferrari crashed and caught fire at the German Grand Prix. He survived with severe burns to his face and lungs. 6 weeks later, he was racing again. In 1979, he founded Lauda Air. By 1991, it had become a small but respected carrier flying from Vienna to destinations across Europe and Asia. Its reputation depended on two Boeing 767s. One of them was named Mozart. On May 26, 1991, the Mozart was flying from Hong Kong to Vienna with a stop in Bangkok. The crew for the second leg was Captain Thomas Welch and First Officer Joseph Thurner. There were 8 flight attendants and 213 passengers on board. The Boeing 767 climbed away from Bangkok at sunset. 5 minutes and 45 seconds after takeoff, a caution message appeared in the cockpit. It warned that the left thrust reverser isolation valve was in the wrong position. A thrust reverser redirects engine thrust forward to help slow an airplane after landing. It must never open in flight. The isolation valve was one of the protections meant to prevent that. The first officer checked the handbook. It warned that additional failures could cause in-flight deployment, but required no immediate action. The captain thought the warning was probably caused by moisture in the engine's electronic control system. The light came and went as they climbed, which seemed to support that idea. They continued. For the next 9 minutes, the airplane climbed normally. Then, at 24,700 feet, the left thrust reverser opened. A massive shudder hit the airplane. The left wing dropped. The aircraft yawed and rolled hard left. The first officer shouted that the reverser had deployed. An automatic system pulled the left engine back to idle, and the crew cut fuel to the engine. It was not enough. The reverser had disturbed the airflow over the left wing. Investigators later found that the left wing was producing 25% less lift than the right wing. Boeing had tested this failure at 200 knots and found the airplane recoverable. Then it used a simulation to extend that result to higher speeds and altitudes. The simulation was wrong. At cruise speed and altitude, the loss of lift was far worse than Boeing had calculated. Later simulator tests showed that even with perfect pilot reaction, the airplane could not be recovered. The pilots of Flight 004 identified the failure almost immediately. They reduced thrust on the opposite engine and tried to roll the airplane level. It did not matter. The 767 rolled past 90 degrees of bank and entered an inverted dive. 29 seconds into the dive, the horizontal stabilizers failed. Then the vertical stabilizer came off. Without a tail, the nose pitched down violently. The wings tore away from the fuselage. The remains of the aircraft fell into the jungle of what is now Phu Toi National Park near the border with Burma. All 223 people on board died. Niki Lauda flew to Thailand and joined the investigation. It was the worst aviation accident in the history of both Austria and Thailand. Lauda told the press that if his airline or his pilots were found responsible, he would resign and shut the company down. Investigators proved that the certification basis for the 767's thrust reversers was wrong. The Federal Aviation Administration issued an emergency directive. Boeing 767s with the same engine type had their thrust reversers deactivated until the design could be fixed. Boeing redesigned the system and added a third lock. The same review was later extended to other large twin-engine jets, and many were modified too. The official Thai report did not find Lauda Air at fault. It blamed Boeing and the 767 certification. But a separate Austrian report, never publicly released, reportedly found that the Mozart had recorded 61 thrust reverser fault messages in the month before the crash. Lauda Air had replaced parts that were not causing the problem. The airline had not contacted Boeing for help. The left thrust reverser also had a locking mechanism marked inoperative 3 weeks before the crash. It should have been deactivated before further flight. That work was not done. The airplane that left Bangkok that night had been legally unairworthy. Niki Lauda kept his airline and continued to fly. He died in 2019 at the age of 70. He once said that of the 2 crashes in his life, the one that killed 223 of his passengers was harder than the one that nearly killed him. Luxair was the country's only commercial passenger carrier. In its 40-year history, it had never lost a passenger. The flight number that morning was 9642. It had come from Berlin. There were 19 passengers, 2 pilots and 1 flight attendant on board. The captain was Claude Porquis. The first officer was John Arendt. Between them, they had 3,300 hours on the Fokker 50. The airport ahead was buried in fog. Visibility at Findel was reported at 275 meters. The legal minimum for a Fokker 50 to attempt a landing was 300 meters. The pilots had spent most of the cruise assuming they would have to divert. They had not planned an approach. They had not gone through the normal briefings before final descent. Then the controller cleared them in anyway. The holding pattern over Luxembourg was full of airplanes waiting for the fog to lift. The controller did not know the visibility was still too low for this particular aircraft. The pilots had not told him. With 20 nautical miles to the runway, he turned them onto the approach, expecting them to land. The first officer was caught off guard. He asked what the controller was doing. The captain decided to start the approach anyway. He skipped the briefing. He told the controller that if visibility was not above the legal minimum by the final approach fix, they would go around. At the final approach fix, the visibility was still 250 meters. The captain called the go-around. Then, 10 seconds later, the controller called back. Visibility had just increased to 300 meters. The captain changed his mind. He decided to land after all. Now the airplane was 300 feet above where it should have been on the descent path. The captain needed to lose altitude quickly to catch the glide slope down to the runway. He pulled the throttles back to flight idle, the lowest power setting normally used in flight. It was not enough. The airplane was still high, so he reached down and lifted a small selector on the throttle quadrant called the ground range selector. The ground range selector was supposed to do nothing in the air. Its job was to let the throttles travel further backward only after the airplane was on the ground, into a zone called the beta range. In the beta range, the throttle stops controlling engine power and starts controlling the angle of the propeller blades. At 0 degrees of pitch, the propellers stop producing thrust. Below 0 degrees, they produce thrust in reverse. That reverse setting is what helps airplanes slow down on a runway. Lifting the ground range selector in flight was a known trick among some Fokker 50 pilots. It was strictly forbidden by the manufacturer, but it could be used to pull the throttles slightly past the normal flight idle stop and make the airplane descend faster. There were 3 layers of protection that were supposed to prevent the throttles from going any further than that in flight. The first layer was a physical stop called the ground idle stop. The first officer had removed it 7 seconds earlier as part of the before landing checklist. The second layer was an electronic stop, controlled by 2 solenoids inside the engines. They were supposed to stay locked as long as the airplane was in the air. The third layer was the airplane's anti-skid system. That system told the solenoids whether the wheels were on the ground. But every Fokker 50 had a hidden defect. When the landing gear was lowered, the 2 anti-skid units inside the airplane powered up. If they powered up almost at the same time, electromagnetic interference could produce a false signal that the wheels were spinning. That false signal was passed to the solenoids, which opened the electronic stop and kept it open for 16 seconds. An airplane that was still in the air had no protection against the throttles going into reverse. The manufacturer had known about this defect since 1988. In 1992, it issued a voluntary service bulletin asking airlines to modify the anti-skid units. The airline that owned this airplane had not made the modification. When Captain Pokes lifted the ground range selector and pulled the throttles back, he expected them to stop at the next mechanical detent. There was no detent. The throttles slid through it. Both engines went into reverse. The propellers passed through 0 degrees of pitch and entered the reverse regime. The airplane decelerated violently. The first officer retracted the flaps to reduce drag. The captain pushed the throttles forward to go around. He did it too fast. On the Fokker 50, when the throttles move from reverse back toward forward thrust, the propellers need to be physically rotated through 0 degrees before the engines can produce forward power again. There is a hydraulic system that does this rotation, but if the throttles are moved too quickly, the counterweights inside the propellers can take over before the hydraulic system has time to act. The counterweights pull the blades to the wrong side of 0. The propellers lock into the maximum reverse angle. That is what happened. Both engines on Luxair Flight 9642 were now stuck in full reverse thrust. The airplane fell out of the sky. It dropped 2,500 feet in a few seconds. Captain Pokes cut the fuel to both engines to stop them from producing any thrust at all. The airplane struck the side of a highway on the outskirts of Luxembourg City, slid across the road, sheared through a row of trees, and came to rest in a farmer's field, where it caught fire. 20 people died. The captain was pulled from the cockpit alive. 1 passenger was found alive in the field. They were the only 2 survivors. Investigators later determined that the airplane had been doomed during a 16-second window the pilots did not know existed on an aircraft type whose flaw the manufacturer had known about for 14 years. In the Pacific island nation of Papua New Guinea, The only practical way to get from one place to another is by air. The mountains are too steep, the jungles too thick, the rivers too wild. The country has built its life around small turboprop airplanes flying short hops between coastal towns and remote interior strips. Most of these flights are run by an airline called Airlines PNG. Between 1987 and 2011, it had suffered 7 fatal accidents. On the afternoon of October 13, 2011, 28 passengers boarded the 8th. Most of them were students and parents bound for a graduation ceremony at a university in the coastal town of Madang. The 2 pilots were both Australian. The captain, Bill Spencer, was 64 years old. The first officer, Campbell Wagstaff, was 40. The airplane was a Bombardier Dash 8, the workhorse twin-engine turboprop of remote aviation. It was 23 years old, and several of its systems had been deferred as inoperative. Among them was the yaw damper, the small system that automatically holds the rudder steady. Without it, the autopilot could not be engaged. The pilots would fly the entire flight by hand. The route was short, 30 minutes across the Finisterre Range, then down through the clouds to the coast. After crossing the mountains, the captain pushed the airplane into a steep descent toward the airport. He was trying to get beneath the broken cloud layer to see the runway. He was not watching the airspeed. The airplane accelerated past 250 knots. The overspeed warning went off. The captain reached for the throttles and pulled them back hard. He pulled them back too hard. On the Dash 8, the throttles can travel into a zone called the ground range. In the ground range, the throttle no longer controls engine power. It controls the pitch of the propeller blades directly. The system is used to taxi the airplane around an airport without producing significant thrust. It is never supposed to be used in the air. To prevent the throttles from accidentally going into the ground range, the Dash 8 has a small physical stop called the flight idle gate. The gate can only be removed by lifting 2 small triggers on the underside of the throttle levers. The triggers are positioned where a pilot's fingers would have to deliberately curl around them. When the captain grabbed the throttles and slammed them back, he grabbed them with enough force to lift one of the triggers without realizing it. Investigators later found that lifting just one trigger by 6 millimeters was enough to release the gate for both throttles. The gate vanished. The throttles slid straight through it. Both engines went into the ground range. 3 seconds later, the propellers were spinning so fast that their tips broke the sound barrier. Inside the cockpit, smoke poured from the panels. The airplane shook so violently that the pilots could not hear each other speak. The captain shouted a question. The first officer shouted back that both propellers were overspeeding. The captain could not hear him. He shouted the question again. Within 10 seconds, both engines had destroyed themselves. The propeller had spun fast enough to begin driving the turbine instead of the other way around. The centrifugal force ripped every blade out of the turbine discs. By the time the captain pulled the throttle back into the flight range, the engine was scrap metal. The Dash 8 was at 16,000 feet with no working engines. The pilots had 3 minutes before they would hit the water. The captain turned the airplane toward the coast, looking for any flat surface large enough to put it down. Through the broken cloud layer, he spotted a wide gravel floodplain along a river that came down out of the mountains. He aimed for it. He did not feather the left propeller. He did not extend the flaps. The airplane fell from the sky at 1,500 to 6,000 feet per minute, and the first officer spent more than a minute on the radio with air traffic control giving their coordinates. 40 seconds before impact, the captain realized that what had looked like a gravel bar from above was actually a field of boulders. He turned the airplane to the right at the last second and aimed for an area of tall grass along the riverbank. Airlines PNG touched down on its belly at 114 knots. The grass was hiding more boulders. The fuselage tore open. The left wing ripped off. The fuel tanks ignited. The cabin was engulfed in fire before the airplane had even stopped moving. The 2 pilots and the flight attendant climbed out of the broken cockpit. A passenger in seat 7B saw a hole in the ceiling above him, pulled himself through it, and ran clear of the wreckage with burns on his arms and back. 2 other passengers reached the emergency exits and were photographed standing in the doorway. They did not make it out. 28 people died in the fire. The investigation later found that aviation regulators in the United States had recognized this exact failure mode in the late 1990s. They had required the manufacturer to design a lock that would prevent the throttles from entering the ground range in the air. The lock had been installed on every Dash 8 operating in the United States since 2000. The Federal Aviation Administration could only mandate the lock for American operators. The country that owned the Dash 8 type certificate, Canada, was the only authority that could mandate it everywhere else. The aircraft that crashed at Madang did not have the lock. After the accident, Canada issued the airworthiness directive that should have been issued years earlier. Every Dash 8 in the world was modified. No Dash 8 has had a propeller overspeed accident from a ground range selection in flight since. Cranbrook Airport sits in a valley between the Rocky Mountains and the Purcells, in the interior of British Columbia. In 1978, it had a single runway, a single radio operator, no control tower, and no air traffic controllers of its own. Pilots flying into it relied on phone calls and timing. The Calgary Control Center would call ahead to Cranbrook and tell the local operator when the next airplane was due. The operator would then make sure the runway was clear. On February 11th of that year, Pacific Western Airlines Flight 314 was due in 23 minutes after departing Calgary. Calgary controllers added a buffer and told Cranbrook to expect the airplane at 1:05 in the afternoon. They were wrong by 10 minutes. The flight had a strong tailwind and was descending faster than Calgary had estimated. The actual arrival time would be 12:55. The airplane was a Boeing 737-200. The captain was Chris Miles. There were 3 flight attendants and 42 passengers on board. While the airplane descended, a snowplow was clearing the runway at Cranbrook. The operator was Terry George, working from a tractor with a radio in the cab. The plan was to call him off the runway a few minutes before the airplane was due, but the airplane arrived 10 minutes early. The radio operator at Cranbrook had not yet called the snowplow off the runway. He did not know the airplane was already on final approach. The flight crew had not made a position report when they passed the final beacon, because it was not strictly required at uncontrolled airports. They had simply flown the approach. At 12:55, the 737 broke out of the clouds, lined up with runway 16, and touched down on the snow-covered surface 800 feet beyond the threshold. Captain Miles brought the throttles to idle and selected reverse thrust on both engines. The thrust reverser doors swung into place. The engines roared into reverse. The airplane began to slow down. 2 seconds later, Captain Miles saw the snowplow on the runway in front of him. It was 1,250 feet ahead. The snow thrown into the air by the plow had hidden it during the approach. In the cockpit, there was no time to think. The brakes, even with full reverse thrust, would not stop the airplane before the collision. Captain Miles decided to go around. He pushed the throttles forward so hard that he fractured his own thumb. The first officer pushed them forward as well. Both pilots pulled back on the control columns. The airplane lifted off the snow, climbed away from the runway, and passed over the snowplow with only a few feet of clearance. The Boeing 737 of 1978 had not been designed for a go-around after reverse thrust had already been selected. Boeing had warned pilots in the operating manual not to attempt it. If a thrust reverser failed to return to forward thrust, a successful go-around might not be possible. Captain Miles had attempted exactly that. When the airplane lifted off, the hydraulic system responsible for closing the thrust reversers stopped working. On the right engine, the reverser doors had been moving back toward the closed position. They froze half open, then slowly drifted back into place under aerodynamic pressure. The right engine produced forward thrust. On the left engine, the reverser doors were caught further out. They froze in the deployed position. The left engine, now at full takeoff power, was producing thrust backwards. The right engine was pushing the airplane forward. The left engine was pulling it back. The airplane yawed hard to the left. The wings rolled with it. The first officer realized what had happened. There was an override switch on the center pedestal that could restore hydraulic pressure to the thrust reverser and close it. He removed his seatbelt and stood up to reach for it. Before he could flip the switch, the captain released the right rudder. The airplane rolled further left. The first officer was thrown off balance. He never reached the switch. 10 seconds after lifting off, Pacific Western Flight banked 90 degrees to the left and dropped nose first into the snow beside the runway. The airplane caught fire on impact. 42 of the 49 people on board died. Captain Miles, with his fractured thumb, was among the 7 survivors. The investigation took years and identified 4 main causes. Calgary Air Traffic Control had given Cranbrook a seriously wrong arrival time. The flight crew had not made a position report at the final beacon, which could have exposed the error. The coordination between air traffic services, the radio station, and the airport authority had not been strong enough to catch it, and the Boeing 737 design did not allow the airplane to recover from a low-altitude go-around when one thrust reverser stayed deployed. After the accident, Canada introduced a new regulation for every aircraft type certified in the country. Every airplane had to be capable of performing what became known as the Cranbrook maneuver. It had to recover from an attempted go-around after thrust reversers had been deployed, even if one of them stuck. Decades later, that requirement was still unique to Canada. The Xi'an MA-60 is a Chinese-built turboprop modeled on a Soviet design from the 1950s. It has all of the safety systems that modern turboprops have. The throttles cannot pass the flight idle stop unless the pilot lifts a small physical trigger. As an extra layer of protection, the manufacturer added an electromechanical lock that holds the trigger in place during flight. The lock is released automatically when the wheels touch the runway. Once the lock releases, the pilot can lift the trigger and pull the throttles back into the ground range to slow the airplane after landing. In theory, the system is excellent. 2 redundant safeguards. A lock that only opens when the airplane is on the ground. When Merpati Nusantara Airlines bought the MA-60 fleet in 2010, the pilots discovered a problem with it. The electromechanical lock did not always release cleanly when the wheels touched down. Sometimes it stuck for half a second, sometimes it stuck for a full second. In those few moments, the pilots could not pull the throttles into reverse to help slow the airplane. The brakes had to do the work alone. The pilots reported the problem to the company. The company contacted the manufacturer in China. The manufacturer was slow to respond. Merpati came up with its own solution. The airline revised its approach checklist. Pilots were now instructed to disable the electromechanical lock during the descent, before the airplane reached the runway. With the lock disabled, the trigger and the throttles were held in place only by the original mechanical stop. The moment the wheels touched the ground, the throttles would slide cleanly into reverse without any delay. The solution worked. It also removed the second safety layer that was designed to prevent the throttles from being moved into the ground range in the air. The airline did not run a safety analysis before issuing the new procedure. By the spring of 2013, every MA-60 in the Merpati fleet was operating with its electromechanical lock disabled on every approach. On the morning of June 10, 2013, Flight 6517 took off from Bajawa, on the island of Flores, headed for the city of Kupang on the southern coast of West Timor. There were 45 adult passengers, 1 infant, 2 flight attendants, and 2 pilots on board. The captain was Aditya Pri Jowano. He was also a designated line training captain, which meant he supervised first officers who were still completing their certification. The first officer was Ah Young Vun Pin, and the next morning's flight was scheduled to be his final qualification check. After that, he would be released to fly without supervision. He was anxious. On the previous few flights, he had developed a habit of pulling the throttles back to the ground idle position, slightly late after touchdown. The captain had pointed it out to him several times. The first officer had taken the criticism to heart. On this approach to Kupang, with 1 day left before his certification, he was determined not to be late again. The first officer was the pilot flying. The captain was monitoring. The approach was visual. The first officer began the descent toward the runway. The captain had already opened the power lever lock during the approach. In the last few hundred feet, the first officer prepared to retard the throttles. He wanted to be ready the moment the wheels touched down. He moved his hand into position. As he did, his fingers caught the underside of the throttle levers and lifted the mechanical trigger. With the electromechanical lock already disabled and the mechanical trigger now released, there was nothing left holding the throttles in the flight idle position. At 90 feet above the runway, the throttles slid back into the ground range. The propeller blades pitched flat. The airplane stopped producing thrust. The propellers, no longer generating lift on their downward stroke, began to act like drag boards. The airplane fell the last 90 feet in less than 2 seconds. It hit the runway at 6 G of vertical force. The wing box, which holds the wings to the fuselage, separated from the airframe. The airplane bounced once, came back down at -3 G, and came to a stop 261 meters past the start of the runway. The fuselage was broken in half but did not catch fire. One of the pilots and 4 passengers were seriously injured. 20 other passengers had minor injuries. Everyone survived. The investigation was conducted by Indonesia's National Transportation Safety Committee, assisted by the Civil Aviation Administration of China. The committee found that the airplane had been working perfectly. Every system on it had operated exactly as designed. The accident had been caused entirely by Merpati's decision to disable a safety lock that the manufacturer had installed for exactly this scenario. Investigators later ran the same approach in a Merpati simulator. They lowered the throttles to the ground idle position at 200 feet, the same altitude at which the first officer had done it on the accident flight. Every time they tried, the airplane crashed. There was no scenario in which it could be recovered. 8 months after the accident, Merpati Nusantara Airlines suspended operations. It never flew again. In November of 1980, a captain at Japan Airlines named Seiji Katagiri began to hear voices. By the autumn of 1981, the voices had grown more intrusive. He started to feel that he was being followed by strangers on his way home from the airport. He told his wife about it, but he did not tell the airline, and he did not tell his doctor. By the winter of 1982, Captain Katagiri was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. He was 35 years old. He had been flying for Japan Airlines for 13 years. The airline had assigned him to a routine domestic rotation between Tokyo and Fukuoka. The aircraft was a McDonnell Douglas DC-8, a four-engine jet manufactured in 1967 and operated by the airline for 15 years. The flight number for the morning return from Fukuoka to Tokyo was 350. On February 9th of that year, Flight 350 took off from Fukuoka at 7:34 in the morning, with 166 passengers and 8 crew on board. At 8:41, the airplane was lined up on final approach to runway 33 right. The gear was down. The flaps were set for landing. The autopilot was flying the airplane. Captain Katagiri was monitoring. Then he began to mutter. The cockpit voice recorder captured noises from the left seat that did not match any normal phase of flight. The captain did not respond when the first officer made the standard 500-foot call-out. He did not call the airplane stabilized, as company procedure required. At the decision height of 200 feet, with the airplane on a stable approach to a clear runway, the captain reached over and disconnected the autopilot. Then he pushed the control column forward and pulled the throttles back to idle. The DC-8 had 4 engines. The 2 inboard engines, the ones closest to the fuselage, were equipped with thrust reversers that could be deployed in flight as an air brake. This was a feature unique to the DC-8 among large passenger jets. Captain Katagiri deployed the reversers on engines 2 and 3. The airplane lost lift, lost speed, and pitched nose down. The first officer realized what was happening within a second. He reached across the center console and grabbed the captain's arm. He shoved the throttles back forward. He tried to pull the control column back. The flight engineer rose from his seat behind them and joined the struggle. The 3 men fought each other in the cockpit. The captain was pushing the nose down. The first officer was pulling it up. The flight engineer was trying to restore engine power. The airplane was at 164 feet and descending at 1,000 feet per minute. The recorder captured the sounds of bodies straining against each other. It captured a voice that was almost certainly the first officer's, telling the captain to stop. It captured the captain crying. 3 seconds after the autopilot was disconnected, the DC-8 hit the shallow water of Tokyo Bay, 510 meters short of the runway. The nose section of the airplane sheared off and rolled to the right. The right wing was torn off. The fuselage broke apart in 3 places. Most of the airplane stayed above the water, because the bay at that point was only a few meters deep. Survivors climbed out through the breaks in the cabin. Rescue boats from a fishing fleet on the shore reached the wreckage within minutes. Among the people climbing into the rescue boats was a man who introduced himself as an office worker. He had taken off his pilot's jacket and his tie and was wearing only a cardigan. He told the rescuers that he had been a passenger in the cabin. It was Captain Katagiri. He was identified within an hour. The first officer, who had been pinned in the wreckage of the cockpit, was rescued alive. The flight engineer was unconscious in the water for 40 minutes before a fishing boat found him. 24 people on board were dead. Japan Airlines suspended Katagiri immediately and turned him over to the police. He told investigators that he had panicked on final approach because he believed the airplane was about to crash. He had felt that the only way to save the airplane was to crash it. A team of psychiatrists examined him over the following weeks. They diagnosed paranoid schizophrenia. They documented a year and a half of untreated symptoms that the airline's medical screening process had never detected. Katagiri was found not guilty by reason of insanity. He was placed in a psychiatric institution. The Japan Airlines investigation concluded that the airline's medical screening was not adequate to detect mental illness in pilots. The questions on the form were superficial. The examinations were brief. There was no requirement for any independent psychiatric evaluation. After the accident, Japan Airlines introduced annual psychiatric screening for all flight crew. Several other carriers around the world adopted similar measures. Captain Katagiri was eventually released from psychiatric care. He lives near Mount Fuji. There is a single lever in every cockpit in the world that is supposed to make an airplane safer. It is the lever that helps stop the airplane on the runway. On a wet day, on a short runway with a heavy load, it is the difference between a normal landing and an excursion off the end of the pavement. Pilots use it every time they land. Most of them, in their entire careers, will pull it tens of thousands of times. It is also the only piece of hardware on the airplane that, if it operates at the wrong moment, will tear the airplane apart in midair. This contradiction is what the engineers have been trying to solve for 50 years. The lever has to be powerful enough to slow a 100-ton aircraft from 160 knots to a stop within a few thousand feet. It also has to be impossible to use in the air. Those two requirements are not easy to reconcile. The first generation of jet airliners had one mechanical stop on the throttle quadrant. It worked until pilots discovered they could lift it in cruise to descend faster, and started doing it. The second generation added a second stop, electrically driven, that was only supposed to release when the wheels touched the ground. It worked until the airplane it was installed on had a hidden electromagnetic fault that quietly disabled it for 16 seconds every time the gear came down. The third generation added a third stop, then a fourth, then a mechanical lockout, then a software lockout, then a redundancy on the software lockout. The accidents kept happening anyway, in different ways, in different countries, on different airframes. A captain who panicked, a captain who was hallucinating, a first officer whose fingers caught a trigger by accident, a mechanic who reinstalled a valve incorrectly, a regulatory agency that adopted the safety modification, and another in a neighboring country that did not. What every one of these stories has in common is that the airplane was not where the failure started. The failure started long before the wheels left the ground. In the design office, where an engineer assumed that pilots would never violate the operating manual. In the certification authority, where a test was conducted at the wrong airspeed. In the maintenance hangar, where a part was replaced for the wrong reason. By the time the pilot's hand was on the throttle, the chain that led to the accident had already been forged. The lever did not bring the airplane down. The lever was simply the place where every earlier error came together. There has not been an inadvertent reverse thrust accident on a Western-built airliner in over a decade. The systems that took 50 years to design have finally caught up to the failure modes they were trying to prevent. The lever is, by every measure, safer today than it has ever been. But it is still the same lever. Somewhere in a cockpit right now, a pilot's hand is resting on it. The throttles will move forward to climb and back to descend, and forward again to land, and back one more time to slow the airplane on the runway. The lever will do exactly what it is supposed to do. Tens of thousands of times today, in airports on every continent, the lever will do exactly what it is supposed to do. And it will continue to do exactly what it is supposed to do until somewhere, on some airplane that no engineer has yet imagined, it does not. If this story moved you, subscribe to Terra Obscura